Hello and welcome to LiveTalk. This is the first in a series of broadcasts by Faithful+Gould, the world-leading programme project management consultancy. My name is David Clifton. I'm the Regional Development Director for Faithful+Gould, and I'm joined today by Rania Fifi, Network Director for The Economist. Now, today we're looking to cover the economic outlooks for selected countries within the GCC marketplace, and also we can try and make it as interactive as possible and discuss around the impact of lower oil prices on the region, and also liquidity issues that have occurred, and looking at funding options around the region. We want to make this as interactive as possible, but we're going to have a Q&A session towards the end of this session, and if you'd like to submit your questions accordingly, we'll try and answer as many as is possible. So, hello, Rania.
Hi, David. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you very much. So, if we start first with the economic outlook for selected certain markets within the GCC, how do you see the sort of general outlook for GDP and inflation currently, and what do you think is driving some of this? And I'm kind of chip in as we move around, I'm sure.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me today. And okay, so you asked a question that's really comprehensive. So what I'm going to do is try and break it up a little bit. Yep. So if we look at the outlook for the region, I think it's important to put everything in a global context. Yep. So if we just think of the factors, be it international or regional, that are really just impacting the growth outlook, we can take, for example, we can start with geopolitical risk. Yeah, so geopolitical risk is obviously something that, raises the cost of capital. It keeps investors kind of, weary a little bit about what the prospects are going forward. So that's one thing we need to be aware of. I know we're going to talk a little bit about it in further detail, but in general, there are some issues that are a bit negative, weighing down on or raising geopolitical risk, but there's also been improvement on that front as well. For example, a Trump presidency, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So there's geopolitical risk, and then there's the global growth narrative. So obviously, as you know, the region is plugged into the global context through oil prices and through trade. So the likes of oil prices impact all the GCC countries, and global trade, for example, impacts the UAE quite significantly, as well as Egypt. So in terms of those two things, we have global growth is pretty much flat. Okay, and in terms of global oil prices, we're going to talk a little bit about that.
We are, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can see that my view is that there's still suffering a little, or quite a bit in certain instances, and I kind of think that the growth here this year is weaker than on a global perspective. However, at least it's starting to look a little bit more positive. And I've said this before, I do think we've been bouncing along the bottom here, and it's nice. And when you start to think around, and we'll come on to it in no doubt more detail, and look at extension of OPEC cuts, etc. That does have a relatively reasonable outlook. I think that the bright spot in terms of growth probably Qatar and the UAE in terms of increasing its GDP this year, and Saudi's still getting to grips with its phenomenal sort of transformation strategy. It's sort of struggling a little bit to get it implemented as quickly as it wants, but it's looking at generational change, and so I can see that's probably a story for growth more like next year, the year after, but the opportunity is phenomenal. So I mean, when you look at the risks, and you're talking about positive and the positive side of things, obviously we've got the political make-weights, and we've obviously got the regional issues with unrest in Yemen and Syria. We've got areas there which in many respects benefits the UAE, I would argue, as a sort of flight to safety or a safe haven, and we're moving on to the sort of the political dynamics from a macro perspective. We've got Brexit, we've got Trump. I mean, generally speaking, I'm of the view it's very positive for this region as a whole scheme of things. Especially if we look at Trump's presidency, we've seen the visit recently, and we've seen his declaration around what he thinks of the Iranian agreement. What are your thoughts on the matter?
Okay, so there are a number of things. So apart from the global narrative that we spoke about and geopolitical risks, there's also the liquidity issue. So you touched upon that. That's also one of the driving factors of growth here. So if we talk about, you're basically saying we're fishing for a bottom, we think we've actually bottomed out. And the reason why we think we've bottomed out is not just because oil prices are double where they were last January. I mean, I think we need to be cognizant of context here. So January 2016, oil prices were $27. Today, they're around $54. So that's literally double. Okay, so sentiment is much more positive. But what happened was when oil prices plummeted about, 65 or 70% from $110, down to like the 40 range, and then, further down to 27. What happened was you had your entire supply chain really negatively impacted by this liquidity crunch. But what we've seen happen over the past 12 months, and we think it's pretty much resolved to a large extent, is that everything's been weeded out of the system. So for example, we take Saudi Arabia, the government has paid off its arrears. There are new directives that are being very strictly adhered to. So for example, Mohammed bin Salman basically was saying you have a 60-day tenor. If you are not paid within 60 days, you take it up with the minister takes it up with him. There's a formal complaint system. Accountability is something that the Saudi regime is very strict about. And so that, in my opinion, is a very positive indicator. And what it has done is the liquidity situation is becoming a little better. So companies have a little bit more better cash flow. And that's part of the reason why we're seeing growth, or that's why we believe that growth has kind of bottomed out. And we think the prospects are a little bit more positive.
And I kind of can add to that really from an industry perspective that I think we've sort of reached the bottom. I mean, we look at last year from going back to, in terms of awards of construction contracts in the region. If we take Saudi, because we've been using it as an example, compared to 2011 to last year, it's 1/3 of the price in terms of the awards, down from sort of 70-odd billion down to nearly 80 billion down to 20-odd. Now, we're starting to see that that's turning. But likewise, when you mentioned the supply chain, we've already seen it. We saw over 1/3 people transit out of the construction industry last year in Saudi Arabia alone. But that was actually, that's where we've seen massive drops in our backlogs as an industry as well. But what people have done is remembering the global financial crisis. They've actually cut harder sooner. Rather than waiting for the inevitable, whereby they can see their backlogs dropping, they've managed to cut back their organisational scale, and then preparing themselves to look for potential growth opportunities in the future. And if you look at, say, Vision 2030 and the National Transformation Programme, people can see the opportunity. But I use the analogy of it's a bit like the squirrel with the nut at the moment in Ice Age, whereby you've got it, it's gone again, and then and it's not quite there, but the movement's in the right direction.
Exactly. So I think it's very important here just to look at trends. I mean, some people, they always ask me, they're like, what are the numbers? What are the growth rates? What are this, what are that? And I always tell them, I was like, let's just focus on trend. Yeah. Because the thing is, I mean, information and data here is a little scarce. And so what we tend to do is compile our story through a qualitative and a quantitative component. And the qualitative component, actually in this part of the region, is very, very, very important. We rely on anecdotal evidence. We rely on, creating our own surveys. We rely on creating even our own benchmarks sometimes. Yep. So I remember back in the day, inflation, for example, the inflation basket wasn't really representative of people's purchasing power patterns. Yep. And so what we did, for example, during my investment banking days, is we created our own basket. We went down and computed inflation literally every single month. But you asked a question earlier that I didn't get a chance to answer, so I wanted to speak about it, and that is geopolitical risk. Yep. So obviously a Trump presidency is on everyone's mind, and you hear the rhetoric in the US and it's one story, and then you hear the rhetoric here and it's completely different. So I definitely want to give our opinion on it. So, at the EIU, we think a Trump presidency bodes very well for this region. It probably bodes better for this region than any other region. I mean, with protectionist measures, and it's going in one direction. But here in the region, I think the resolve to deal with radical ideologies, the resolve to deal with, weeding out the likes of ISIS, the fact that, and this is, very positive for the GCC, the fact that Iranian ambitions can be curbed through basically, making sure that the nuclear program is pretty much, dealt with. The fact that, Saudi Arabia and the U.S. are aligned when it comes to Yemen. I think that's very, very, very important. But having said that, I think that in order for us to see a Yemen resolution, I think we kind of need to see a Syria resolution first. And so that can take a little bit of time, because that's obviously the U.S. and Russia kind of dealing with that situation. And so once the U.S. and Russia kind of deal with that, then, I think everything else will kind of fall into place. So geopolitical risk in the sense of dealing with the issues, is pretty much less. And then if we look at Saudi Arabia, for example, and we look at, the risks associated with Saudi Arabia, I think Saudi Arabia is in a much, much, much more solid position today than it was 2 years ago. And the reason behind that is not just an Obama administration that was non-interventionist. I also think that King Salman, I think there was a lot of skepticism regarding King Salman and regarding the policies. The policies were new. Everyone didn't know what to make of it. And so, King Salman ascends to the throne, appoints, his son as deputy crown prince. And there's obviously the crown prince, Mohammed bin Nayef. And there was just a change in policies, be it foreign policy, direct confrontation in Yemen, be it, rewriting the social contract, be it, just policies in general for accountability. We mentioned accountability first, and I think that is extremely important, and investors like visibility and they like accountability, so that's very positive. And when we talk about consolidating power internally, King Salman has consolidated power, so he's appointed his son as deputy crown prince, he's deputed another son as ambassador to the US, he's appointed another son as state of minister of energy, and obviously the oil sector is the linchpin of the Saudi economy. So when we talk about consolidation of power domestically, I mean, obviously there's a solid base right there. So I think geopolitical risk is definitely lower today than it was a year ago.
Okay, and I don't actually disagree, and and also from my own perspective as a Brit, you kind of see the and then we'll come on to the financing and stuff in a little bit, but the reach out that you'll get from not just the UK but other European economies, because Europe's going to hurt and Britain's going to hurt and everyone's going to get a bit of pain from the Brexit situation. They will be reaching out to anywhere in the world, basically looking for growth opportunities insofar as they don't really know what they don't know right now in terms of how's the divorce going to work out for them. So with that as well, although not as big a contributing factor as Trump presidency, I think that there's opportunity for the GCC with that when you look at the EU reaching out to the world as well.
Absolutely. So I think Brexit actually, I think we still need to see basically how Article 50 is going to play out, and we need to understand the semantics behind the new agreement. But one thing's for sure, the UK is going to be very adamant about forging its own free trade agreements. And so the GCC, or the MENA region in general, actually is a very important investment destination for FDI going out of the UK. For example, the largest investor in the Egyptian economy are UK companies. So it would make a lot of sense. It would be logical for the GCC or Egypt, to come up with an FTA with the UK. So I think it's going to be a very positive step, and I also think it's a very good entry point for investments going into the UK. I mean, obviously with the devaluation of the British pound and that solid partnership already in existence, it just makes it that much more, lucrative in terms of opportunity. So I think we're going to see more activity. But again, and I have to say this, and I'm going to repeat myself many times throughout this, throughout this talk, visibility is something so incredibly important, and investors remain on the sidelines if there isn't a clear agenda, if there isn't transparency, if we don't know where we're heading. I mean, I'll give you a number, and it's a very astonishing number, but we did this survey amongst high net worth individuals in the GCC. Sorry, it wasn't us. Sorry, it was Emirates Investment Bank, but we were speaking at their event, and apparently GCC high net worth individuals hoard 27% of their asset base in cash. You know what I mean? That's a huge amount. It's huge. And I'll give you another example. Apple. Look at companies in the U.S. They're hoarding so much cash. Apple sits on $188 billion worth of cash. That's larger than Qatar's GDP. So in those terms, when cash is on the sidelines, that's not a positive thing. So I think geopolitical risk, because it was just rising throughout the past few years, it caused a lot of companies and individuals to hoard cash. But I think the more clarity we have, we're going to start seeing investments back into the system.
Okay. And with that then, moving on to the next question is, what sort of opportunities and challenges do you see for that, I mean, moving through that in terms of the GCC's marketplaces? Because we're starting to see transparency opening up in Saudi Arabia. We're starting to see the actual rollout of the Vision 2030 and also the NTP, although it's not quite, but it's not quite moved yet, but it's moving. What's your views on that?
So my view is the main market, obviously the most lucrative market is Saudi Arabia, and not just because of its sheer size, but because of NTP 2020. Just very quickly, NTP 2020 is a very comprehensive plan. You know, it talks about fiscal sustainability, it talks about localization, it talks about privatization, it talks about creating jobs, it talks about moving jobs from the public sector to the private sector. It talks about, you know, enabling the private sector to be that main driver of growth. I mean, if we look at resources and where they were allocated before, and I'm not a fan in general of looking at the past, but it's important to know where we are to understand where we're heading. And what happened was the government was actually the main driver of growth. And in any other country in the world, the government's main role is being a regulator. So the whole point of transitioning to this new way of doing business, to who's going to drive growth, the transition is bumpy, and I think people need to understand that. I'll give you another example, and this is one of the countries in the world where they call it the miracle on the Han River, you know, basically South Korea. South Korea has had phenomenal growth, but if you look at what South Korea achieved, okay, it took quite a while for South Korea to achieve, you know, what it has in terms of industrialization. So if Saudi Arabia is talking about diversifying its economy, becoming an industrial hub, and doing it in 15 years, that is quite ambitious.
It's my view on it's a bit more. It's a target. It's an ambition, but we always need to set our ambitions and our targets to be very stretching. So reach for the stars, hit the moon kind of territory.
Exactly.
And you know, Korea started out in the 50s looking for its economic transformation. So Saudi really needs to consider this as a generational change.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
And it's going to be, and if you see the results of it in 30 years time, well, fantastic if you do. But that's how long it took. That's how long it took South Korea to move through that transitory period.
Exactly.
But that's still a fantastic opportunity for a business and for an individual.
Absolutely.
I mean, if I look at it from our industry perspective, I see huge opportunity with independent water and power projects. We see the infrastructure that needs to continue to be evolved and built. The population is still growing. It's still very young, half the population under 30. There's a huge requirement. Not necessarily, just physically from the scale of the population. So it's what's 58% of the GCC population is in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
So that represents a huge chance. And I think it's probably still the biggest growth market for my industry, certainly. If I look at UAE, whilst representative of the second largest market, it's pretty well catered for in terms of does it really need more hotels just at the moment?
It's a bit saturated. Well, tourism. Well, I disagree with tourism.
Yeah?
I disagree because they have a plan to basically reach 20 million visitors by 2020. So the ambition is there. There's Expo 2020. They're going to be hosting that. So
what next after that, though?
But there are programs. There are programs, and I get asked that question all the time. There's a space program, there are accelerators, there are incubators, so there's a drive for technology. And if I could just touch upon technology right now, because there are no really tech companies that create technology, so we look at kind of the digital economy representative by ICT kind of spend.
Yeah.
And in terms of contribution to GDP, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE are really low. We're talking about 3.8% of GDP being contributed by the ICT sector in Saudi Arabia and roughly 4.4% in the UAE. That's quite low. And I'll give you a point of comparison. The UK, which is the highest in the world, is 12%.
Yes.
Okay. The global average is about 5.5%. So there's still just one tiny sector, but it's not tiny because it really can, it just reverberations, throughout the entire economy. You're talking about massive opportunity of growth. I was just in Saudi Arabia and I came yesterday and I was in Jeddah and I hadn't been to Jeddah in 10 years. And to just see, the infrastructure that needs to be upgraded, everything, there's opportunities. The airport itself, there's massive opportunity everywhere across the board. Transportation, there isn't a railway system. There isn't, a port big enough to absorb the needs of the entire Western province. So when we talk about opportunities, they're massive.
Absolutely. And when you focus in on the Western province as well, you start to look at the growth and we're looking through for religious tourism.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's an interesting one because we're actually involved with the airport in Jeddah. And there is huge expansion plans still further on the next phases 2 and 3. And you look at the way that GACA's got 27 airports that it's looking to develop to, also partially promote internal tourism as well as bringing people in. So yeah, there is without question, a huge opportunity. And the infrastructure requirements of the Western Province, are huge. It's not quite being ignored, but it's just not...
It's just taking time.
It's just taking time.
It's just taking time.
You've seen Riyadh Metro come out of the bag, and we know a lot about that scheme being having both had exposure to the scheme previously.
Right.
But Jeddah and Dammam still need picking up. So, how you look at all of that opportunity, and we talk about transparency, and that's what investors are looking for. I mean, generally speaking, would you consider the region to still be attractive in terms of the risk perspective from an investor, or from attracting that investment?
Well, okay, there's two things to look at over here. So first of all, and this is the theme going forward, there's competition for FDI across the board. So when you talk about Saudi Arabia, talking about emerging markets, so they're up against every other emerging market to attract FDI. So in a day and age where political risk is quite high, obviously that it wards off or it curbs investments to a large extent. The higher your appetite, obviously you'll be able to go into these markets. So what I think is going to happen going forward is the likes of Saudi Arabia and the UAE making sure that they create a better environment to attract that FDI. So accountability is definitely one of them. Transparency when it comes to data. So we see the smart initiatives here in the UAE, and it's great, and businesses love it, and that's why your company, my company, we're based here.
Yeah.
Logistically it makes sense. The facilities that we have access to, it all makes sense. But there's still more, requirement in terms of data visibility. So I think going forward we're going to see more improvement. They have to improve, because it's kind of like what we were talking about before. So the UAE market, there are opportunities, but to an extent, the opportunity is a lot outwards, or it depends on the growth cycles of other neighboring countries.
Yep.
So in order for us to build something past Expo 2020 and to build that sustainable economic model, we're going to need more information and more help from the government side. In Saudi Arabia's perspective, there is more data visibility, but you need more government enabling.
Okay. Yep. Okay. No, that's fine. I believe we've got a subtle thing with your mic slightly. Has it come back on?
Is this fine?
Yeah. Okay. No, it's fine. It's just.
Okay.
I think it was just must have been your hair going away. Yeah. No worries. Okay. So in terms of moving on to the next conversation, which is this sort of. We've alluded to some of it, the impact of the lower prices, tightening liquidity, and a theme around the cash flow cycles of funding, financing, and raising capital activities. We've spoken about hitting the bottom. We're both pretty aligned in terms of our outlooks, and we've alluded to a couple of points in regards to liquidity. I mean, I'll just take the statement that the Bank of International Settlements stated that from mid-2015 to mid-2016, liquidity shrunk worldwide by around 12%. I see it that it's starting to ease. It hasn't found its way to the ground in a lot of instances yet, but I'm starting to see it easing. Would you agree with that?
Of course it's easy. I mean, if you look at, obviously, Saudi Arabia being the largest economy, the fact that the government is paying its arrears definitely eases liquidity. The fact that oil prices are at $54 versus where they were last year, definitely easing liquidity. So we definitely feel it. I mean, balance sheets are kept lean, okay? So that is an issue. And remember we were talking about, companies hoarding cash. So liquidity isn't going back into the system per se. So there's still that bit. But in terms of the macro environment, there's definitely been we're in a much better position today than we were last year, for sure.
Absolutely, and I kind of agree. And I'm just going to mention it from an industry perspective. We're starting to see it. I'm starting to see activity and some level of confidence. It hasn't transited through the financing system, reached its way for us into development or government agencies just yet. But you're starting to see that plausible and feasible schemes from a private sector side of things are starting to get much more attention. You're also starting to see that governments are starting to have meaningful conversations rather than elusive alluding to conversations around schemes and projects. And in a lot of instances, we take Saudi again as an example. They just got to go through a reprioritisation and set things up again in a way that is transparent and will attract investment. We've seen very good positives, such as contractors getting around 50 billion Saudi riyals worth of debt payments in Q4 last year, and that's a good starter for 10. It doesn't fix the problem.
No, it doesn't.
But
it's a start. Remember, we were saying the whole gist of it is we're in a new norm. Okay,
Yeah.
and we're just adjusting to how to do business. Before, the economies were flush with cash. Obviously, after the Arab Spring, there was this drive to create this, extremely positive sentiment, robust economic activity to just, create opportunities. And the thing is, everything has a cycle.
Yep.
And, obviously this was induced by oil prices literally plummeting 75% or so. But we're fine in the sense that we're headed in the right direction, but it's just very bumpy and it takes time to getting adjusted to. So.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that you seem to be able to have retained some knowledge of lessons learned from the previous cycle. There's an acquaintance of mine, one of the large banks, who used to say of the region that there's 7-year cycles here and 5-year memories. But it seems to be that we've actually kind of remembered some of that lesson. So when we look at say for instance our industry, and it used to be we'll fall off the cliff before we resize our business. We've seen some resizing of businesses, understanding that this cycle has started to come into effect. So there is some of that positivity, but that new norm is starting to mature both
exactly.
the market.
I think it's just very, we need to be very clear about what we're saying. A lot of people say like, oh, you sound very positive. What I'm trying to say is that it's not conducive to be stuck in last year's mentality.
Yeah.
Last year's mentality is, it was not negative per se, but people didn't understand what was going to happen next. But I think what we need to be very clear about is that we do have continued challenging environment by all means. You know what I mean? Oil is not back at $110, nor do we see it going back to $110 anytime soon.
Yeah.
But all I'm trying to say is that we don't have bailouts, we don't have huge write-offs, we don't have, massive consolidations across sectors. We already saw that.
Yeah.
So obviously in the UAE we had the likes of Mubadala and IPEC merge. We had the likes of NBAD and FGB merge. So the consolidation phase was a natural progression of a very tight liquidity cycle, of the system. But what we're seeing now is easing, bumpy road, and definitely more prospects. At least there's light at the end of the tunnel, and I think that's what the message that we're trying to convey.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, the more opportunity side of things, what do you think is the next move? We've seen sort of bond issuances last year, and we've seen that some of that money probably being used to pay people off, and that sort of that's starting to mature that cycle. Historically, bond issuances, alternative types of financing, risk sharing have been no-goes really for the region, and we don't want to share risk. You can have the risk. So it's certainly in my industry is usually the way in which things have been done. Do you see more of that opportunity? What's the outlook looking like from your perspective?
So there's a couple of things. I think that, for example, Oman and Saudi Arabia are two completely different, markets, and I think the prospects are very different. I think, for example, Saudi Arabia, we saw last year they went to the market hoping to raise $10 billion. They came back with $17 billion. Okay, and they were testing the markets. They wanted to see a little bit of pricing, and the fact that we don't think interest rates in the U.S. are going to be, we're not going to see as many hikes as we had previously anticipated. I think it makes it a very good time period for any of the GCC countries to really raise a lot of capital. So we could see more bond issuances, we could see international raising, of capital. We could definitely see that in Saudi Arabia. I mean, debt to GDP is still quite low. It's still 11%. Yeah. And if you were to look at previous cycles, debt to GDP was 100% in Saudi Arabia at one point, and then the government usually pays down its debt once oil prices are a bit higher. So we can see that with the likes of Oman. So I know that there was just a recent bond issuance, and it's a little bit pricier for Oman because the prospects of Oman are, at fiscal deficits are higher, prospects for revenue are lower, and so it makes the markets very different. And I think, sorry to cut you off, but I think the most important thing is to understand that whereas once upon a time all the oil producers had the same narrative, I think every single one of the GCC countries has its own narrative today. Yeah. Everyone is dancing to their own tune. And I think that's very, very, very important for investors. What happens is, and we see this all the time, is that investors kind of look at the region and they think it's really small and they think it's just one story and that's it. It's either an oil play or a non-oil play and a demographic play. And I urge people to kind of look at each market very differently because each one tells their own tale.
Absolutely, and I sort of agree. I mean, yes, Oman's got some, like you said, some issues when it comes around its deficit, and And it's not obviously as oil rich and gas rich as you look at Saudi.
It's downgraded to
Big triple B,
yes.
yeah. And you got Saudi at A plus and Qatar and UAE at AA. Yeah. So they're going to be attractive, and and Saudi's already sort of come out and made a play that he's going to look to go into the market for another 15 billion potentially this year. Kuwait's looking at around 10, and Oman's intimated that he'd like to go back to the market as well, didn't it? However, Oman's probably got a lot more challenges around that, but Saudi's got an incredible amount of foreign capital reserves anyway, still, even though it's drawing down. It's wealthy by anyone's standards. And
that's what we know.
Yeah. Well, it's what we know. That's the declared reserves. Yeah. It's what we don't know. There's probably a lot more of that as well.
Exactly. But again, Saudi Arabia has that privilege of collateralizing any sort of bond issuance against black gold. Who's going to say no to black gold?
No, absolutely. Yeah. So, with that...
We're talking about IPOs.
Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot to comment about that. So we're definitely expecting more bond issuances. Yeah. And with regards to IPOs, so there's definitely the possibility for Saudi Arabia to be upgraded to the MSCI Emerging Market Index. And that decision should be made by June 2018. So prior to that, we're expecting something, and then after that, we're expecting something else. So in terms of IPOs, we're definitely expecting the market to add, IPOs are very necessary to add depth and breadth to the market. So you don't want investors to look at the Saudi market and think, oh, oil play, You kind of need to diversify your offering. And especially if you're making room for Aramco IPO. Everyone always says Aramco's too large and there's going to be, dual and triple listings possibly around the world. And, I definitely agree with that point of view. But the whole point is, if Aramco's being valued at $2 or $3 trillion and...
Or 200 billion, depending on which person you listen to at the moment. It's all of that kind of swing and everything in between.
Yeah, so the offering would possibly be around $200 billion, but the market cap of the entire company would be $2 or $3 trillion, just accounting for its reserves alone. But the whole point being is that in itself, compared with the market cap today, and I'm not sure what the market cap is today, it's probably around $600 billion or maybe a little bit more. But obviously, that's putting 70% of your eggs in one basket, and that just doesn't make sense by any sort of logic whatsoever. So we're definitely expecting IPOs. We've heard of Saudi Arabian Airlines IPOing. There's definitely going to be more of that.
You've seen that GACA's being turned into private companies and the airports and sort of spun out. You can see logical cases for the SIPO or the Saudi Ports Authority being floated as well. And generally speaking, some of these businesses are actually run relatively well and are relatively profitable, which brings money back into the coffers, which, from my perspective as our industry, as we look forward and we look at the reprioritisation of programmes and projects within the kingdom, starts providing some level of funding from a government level, whilst combining it with an alternative funding, which we were talking around earlier. Everything's PPP currently in Saudi. I'm sure it bears very little resemblance to what we would understand it from back in the UK or North America. But that starts bringing in the depth and the breadth that you were talking about, where we try to mix it up, because at the moment you kind of get the feeling that 100% of our schemes might be alternatively funded, which is just saving problems for the future. But with that IPO, so it provides the government central cash, which hopefully should change the dynamics of how things work in the industry from our perspective. So with that, just to sort of finish off, we're talking around the oil prices and we're talking around the government balance sheets. Where do you see horizons for
oil prices?
Yeah, in terms of, and also the how they're going to manage this balance sheet thing to sort of into the short to mid-term?
So two things here. So oil prices, obviously what moves oil prices are supply and demand.
Of course.
The value of the US dollar, investors' perception, pricing strategy of oil producers, and weather, right? Yeah. So supply and demand, this is an extremely fluid scenario, because we actually don't know how profitable shale oil producers are anymore. Once upon a time, when oil was going down from $110 to $50, we saw a lot of shale oil producers pulling off the market, right? But today, they're in the market, and they're actually pumping more, which leads us to believe that their profit or their break-even point is becoming lower and lower. So technological advancements are changing the supply side of the story, okay? When we look at demand, demand is growing. I mean, there's population growth worldwide.
Yeah.
Even though there's a drive towards alternative energy usage, it's still, crude oil is literally, it's the cheapest source of energy. So we think that that demand growth, at least over the medium to long term, in terms of 5 to 10 years, is still there. It's still plausible. So I think in terms of supply and demand, it's very difficult to quantify right now. In terms of the dollar value, obviously, if anything, the dollar is strong and it's going to continue to being stronger. So that kind of caps oil prices. And then pricing strategy, what we see is obviously OPEC, cutting production to kind of put a floor on oil prices. And even though we saw oil prices test, the $45 to $49 range, it didn't stay there for long. So I think we're at a point right now, save, force majeure kind of incident, I think it's fair enough to say that $50 is a floor for now, but we think they're going to be range bound. Yeah. We don't think oil prices are going to go above $57 this year. Again, unless there's some sort of, weather factor or all of a sudden global demand is just through the roof, but we don't think that's going to happen, for at least another 12 to 18 months. We don't see that kind of visibility.
But with that, and we'll debate where the break-evens are on the balance sheets. I'm sure.
Well, break-even. It's a very good question, because I think before the Trump, for example, the Trump visit, I would have told you that we could have seen deficits kind of, just shrink a little bit in Saudi Arabia. But with these new orders of $100 to $350 billion worth of investments, we don't have visibility on how that's going to be financed. We don't know whether it's going to come out of, fiscal deficits, or that's going to come out through reserves, or that's going to come out through something else, and we don't know. So
you kind of have to look at the length of the contracts as well, because some of the commentaries that I've been picking up on is if you take 100 billion, you spend it, and you spend, just say a defence contract, 100 billion, you spend it over 10 years, that's 10 billion per annum, when the defence budget's 25 billion, so it's probably already in the budget.
Yeah, but given the fact that there is direct military confrontation in Yemen and there's a military deterrent strategy, I highly doubt it's going to be a 10-year kind of payment plan.
But the concept is there isn't that kind of view. And I mean, look at
Someone did tell me something, though. They told me the costliest part of actually a military operation is boot on the ground, having boots on the ground. Yeah. So, there is that component that we just don't know how costly it is. So I think the main takeaway here is that we're expecting another deficit, this year. We're probably going to see another deficit next year. But the whole point is Saudi Arabia is able to raise capital. And I think ultimately that's what determines, your sound, fiscal stance, or not. So I think Saudi Arabia is in a fine position.
Okay, with that, thank you very much for that debate. And there'll be a recording of this put onto Faithful at point later in time. But if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to write in and let us know. But other than that, okay. Did
you disagree with anything that I said, David?
Some of it.
Some of it.
Look, in terms of raising, in terms of raising the capital, Saudi's granting a deficit. Okay, most economies in the West run deficits much higher debt to GDP ratios, but I do think that historically the kind of conservative nature of the region will bring it back into some sort of balance for and sort of break even sooner, slightly rather than later, which is why it's interesting on the oil price. What are they going to cut? Because something's going to get cut. I mean, you look at Saudi, that's about 35% of the budget really goes on salaries for the government staff, and we saw the cutback and then the put back in.
I'm actually happy that you mentioned that. So we didn't get a chance to talk about taxation when we talk about the investment proposition. So one of the things that I did want to talk about NCP 2020, and that is the investment proposition has changed in the region. All of a sudden, you went from pretty much an economy that wasn't taxed to an economy that is taxed. So that changes people's point of view. And whereas I want to say, for example, VAT, a 5% tax rate it's absorbable. That isn't the main takeaway. The main takeaway is the introduction of taxes and not knowing where it's going to end.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So I think it's that lack of visibility that we have. I mean, I was just in a meeting yesterday and someone was saying that, no, well, VAT is going to reach about 10% by 2020. You know, so we do kind of understand when that ceiling is going to happen, if that's the case. And I think that that in itself is going to, I think, make that whole, remember how I was saying competition for FDI is going to be the name of the game. So I think that it's, governments are going to have to be very clear about the environment that they're going to create for businesses and the support that they're going to lend to SMEs. The more you have of that, the more investments you're likely to see despite taxation. Now, if you don't have that visibility, it's probably going to curb investments.
Yeah, I sort of don't actually disagree particularly. And I mean, I think one of the things around this taxation environment is, like anything, when the planning and preparation, we've got quite a lot of the macro stuff about what we think's coming and all the rest of it, but the how it's going to happen bit seems to have a little bit more to go around it because people don't know. I mean, you look at because it's in a low tax environment, you've got low numbers of accountants or something in multinational organisations in this part of the world. And suddenly they're going to have quite a lot of people.
It's a cost incurred of companies, of course. I mean, be it systems, be it accountants,
training, development, absolutely.
Cash flows. I mean, that is the number one thing. You are going to impact every single cash flow of every single company. If you're waiting for a rebate from someone and it's going to take 6 months, you know, that impacts your cash flow. And I think the gesture that Saudi Arabia did by reinstating some allowances into salaries, I think that's just, it's putting money back in people's pockets before you start taxing them. So it's kind of giving them that, you know, boost in a level of confidence, and then
we'll take it back again.
We'll take it back. But you know what? At the beginning, they're taking it back through discretionary spending, so through sugary taxes and excise tax on tobacco.
Yep.
So it's a category that's considered sort of like, you know, a sin tax category. So it's somewhat acceptable.
Yes.
You know, it's the minute you start, you know, taxing expats, for example, that's when, you know, multinationals that are setting up shop in Saudi Arabia are going to think like, So we heard about the levy on dependents.
Yeah, we have done, yeah.
Yeah, so that's definitely going to be something that, you know, people are going to consider, and many people are going to think like, should I bring my families or should I just back home? So we're definitely going to see a little bit of, you know, turbulence amongst, you know, multinationals and their investments in Saudi Arabia in terms of human capital.
And it is quite interesting when you start mentioning around this sort of taxation. I mean, we've seen across the board, but it's been on this industry abounds. The import tax used to be 5%, and now it's not quite being structured, but it's sort of in a free float up to 20%, depending on what you're buying. Although it's not being evenly applied. But when you factor that in from a regional perspective, and you talk about the GCC used to act as one, or it looks as one play or something such as that, they're competing against. There's going to be a competition. So whilst they're trying to.
Cigarettes, by the way, in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain.
Yeah.
So Bahrain imposed taxes on cigarettes before Saudi Arabia did. So we saw a lot of
traffic. Yeah, absolutely.
The cost is pretty busy.
Yeah, no. But that's the sort of thing. So there's that intrinsic competition that's coming. That's in between. It exists between Emirates in some instances. But you see that intrinsic competition. So they're trying to level the balance sheet, trying to mature the market, but still be in competition with technically my friends. So yeah, absolutely. Okay, I mean on that, there's a question up here. Based on macroeconomic trends and growth in GCC, which industry will have the biggest demand in GCC markets, aviation infrastructure, oil and gas, power, etc., or for KSA, UAE, Qatar and Oman? I'm guessing it's probably orientated around our industry, I suspect. I'm guessing right now, in the short term, I would suggest it's power and water, primarily orientated because of the length of development time it takes to go through funding, design, build. You can build a villa notionally in a few months, but it doesn't take a few months to build a power station to put the lights on. And I can see that already. And in this region, IWPP, independent water power projects and independent water projects. Yeah, mainly Saudi. Well, in fairness, Oman's using models like that as well, to be fair. And that has got a relatively well-established model that people can utilise, so cost per litre or cost per kilowatt hour or something along those lines. But then moving more toward, and I think it's a regional play. There's a bit on the social infrastructure side of things. So health, housing. I think that's a...
We definitely think that, for example, we think there's a drive to privatize healthcare.
Yep.
That is a single thing that when we talk about budget, there's been very clear communique that there's going to be that drive. So we see opportunity there, and obviously Saudi Arabia being the largest market. I mean, the healthcare industry here, also there's opportunities here in the UAE for sure. And especially because part of it is already privatized. Even when we see the likes of Cleveland Clinic, for example, bringing upon that new kind of proposition. So medical tourism, for example. So,
absolutely.
That's we see opportunity there, and I think that there's also a huge drive for transportation. So look at smart cities and look at the initiatives there. The UAE is a pioneer, in terms of the region of that drive towards smart cities. But I think there's definitely a lot more opportunities, throughout the entire GCC. Saudi Arabia is one thing when it comes to transportation. You can't be the largest market in the region and still rely on trucks basically driving your needs from Jabal Ali. So I think going forward, we're going to start seeing that ports being developed in Saudi Arabia. I think there's going to be that drive for that railway. We're going to see that drive for smart city initiatives throughout different pockets in Saudi Arabia. So
absolutely, and the rail of the driver has to be goods, because goods make money, passengers generally lose money. And
cargo is the most important factor of a railway, right?
Absolutely. And so Saudi Arabia's scale means that I think it will get round to it. I mean, GCC Rail announced it was going to try and do the whole thing PPP. Sort of think that might not quite work out quite how it's planned, but there is obviously a huge demand for shifting that stuff around to take the pressure off the road networks. But I think
Qatar is definitely one country that is spearheading this whole railway, and they have to because of 2022, and they have this drive that they have to have this railway in place. So
I sort of get that, but I mean, look, I think that it's what will drive it. I mean, if you look at Etihad Phase 1, driven by ADNOC's requirement to basically to bring down the cost per kilometre shipping and be able to take its byproducts essentially to the Abu Dhabi port and ship it. Those are driving factors. It would a vision, always having the vision of 2022 or the vision of 2020. These things are allowed to be amended when those organisations change. It's about understanding the actual needs and whether they have some sort of rationale behind them. So the fact it would be nice to ship passengers on a train from Dammam to Jeddah, or from from the coast in North Qatar to Doha.
But
nice.
I think it's the FIFA 22-20 thing. I think that's more of a drive there to at least continue with the investments on the ground. I mean, we did a project with Qatar Rail, and it seems like they're continuing. They've scaled back in terms of, the tenor, so in terms of, their milestones that they want to achieve, but they didn't pull the plug on it, for example, as Etihad Railway have. Not pull the plug, but, just kind of shelter for a little bit.
Yeah.
But at least in Qatar, there is still some sort of movement. The Riyadh Metro project, I mean, it's still working on, it's still on the ground.
Yeah, no.
Even if they scaled back, some of their investments, but it's still something that they're working on, so... I don't know. I'm sure
the rail's one that I'm a little bit more cynical on, unless it's part rail to suit the goods industry, which driven by Qatar Petroleum and Qatar, driven by Aramco needs, and driven by maybe the Kazan development for Oman with BP, and that's obviously quite in the centre of Oman. Those are the drivers that I think will drive this. Not that it would be nice to connect everything together. The reliance on aviation here is strong, and the plans on airports for the regions are still fantastically high. So I mean, moving forward, that they look like potential further expansion. But I do see the play really as a all the way back for this entire industry of power, water, growing population, long lead time, short term, and then we move into social infrastructure, and then the question belies itself for the UAE and then for Saudi is the continued growth for hospitality in terms of touristic growth. So another question regards to oil price: how much of an impact will they have on the construction infrastructure development industry, and how will they impact societal development programs? It's a two-sprung question: the societal development side of things, and also the construction infrastructure. Like, it's from the.
So it's PPP.
Yeah, that's where basically the alternative financing has lifted its head. Whether or not it goes through in the quantum of what's discussed, I think again that's possibly an ambition side of it, and also they may well overcommit in terms of the percentage that they have in terms of projects. But I kind of think that you're going to see a bit more of a rationalisation when you start looking at taking in funding from international markets. When you're a government, you've got a very strong balance sheet, and you decide that what you want to do is build $200 billion worth of railway network today, and you can pay for it all off straight away. That's fine. But whether or not international markets have all of that available for you, and there's competition from other parts of the world, you're more likely to harmonise the levels of the industry rather than the big peaks and troughs that we've got, because
it's a new norm. It's just getting used to a slower pace. So to answer that question, I think what's important to just be aware of is that we're not going to expect the same kind of volume of business that we had previously.
Yeah.
With our opportunities, these opportunities are going to rely on the private sector, basically contributing more than just, taking, a project award and then just completing a process without adding any financing themselves. So I think the whole point of PPP is to add that sort of liquidity or to add that kind of financing option so that the government basically doesn't have to bear the entire brunt of it. So I think that's going to slow the pace down a little bit. And then with regards to development programs, I think if we take, for example, Vision 2030, there's a very clear vision there. For example, adding females into the workforce in Saudi Arabia. That's extremely important. We're talking about currently Saudi females making up 13% of the workforce. If you just do a very small computation of, raising it to 30% with today's numbers, we're talking about 3 million extra people that are going to become income earners. Yeah. That's definitely going to be a change for sure. We're talking about societal impact. For sure. We're already talking about, digital consumption in Saudi Arabia being amongst the highest in the world, and that's bringing about that kind of change. And then women becoming income earners, that's definitely going to bring about a change. And we work with Saudi youth, and the mentality there has changed completely. They understand that they're not entitled to anything. They understand that they need to contribute to the economy. We just stayed in Jeddah at the first Saudi hotel that is owned by Saudis, operated by Saudis. Everyone working at this hotel is Saudi. We were basically Saudi female chefs there, and they were serving people, and the wait staff were Saudi. And so my point being is that the mentality has changed. They understand that they need to contribute. But again, I think the biggest issue here is the skills gap.
Absolutely.
Talent. So it's a matter of, we can have the greatest ambition in the world, but if we don't have the talent to fill that ambition, that's what's going to kind of curb our growth. And I think that's it, right?
That's quite interesting, because I can draw comparisons with our industry, but knowing that it applies to other industries as well, but not having as much exposure to it. We've got the rollout of project management offices across the ministries within Saudi Arabia and government-related entities dropping all the way down. But obviously one of the first things is to provide that transparency and governance that the markets are looking for when you go to funding for them. But the second key critical is to build capacity so that they can do it themselves. And whilst the ambition is very, 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 very constrained in terms of we'd like to do it in 3 years, yes, okay, it will be a generational thing, but the attitudes and perceptions are starting to change, which is what you need. Because you can teach people new skills, but you can't teach them a new attitude.
Exactly. So attitude is great. It's a bumpy road. We have to
absolutely
have to repeat that again. It's a bumpy road. So transitions are never easy, but the whole point is the direction, and the direction is that the government, the regime has a plan that's in the right direction. They're headed to the right place. Okay,
cool. Okay. What's the view on the expansion of the manufacturing sector, particularly food products, to reduce importing of finished goods?
Food security is an issue. It will always remain an issue throughout the region. Obviously, the majority of land here is barren. Yep. There have been initiatives to produce local food. One of the main issues is the cost of water, and I think that's what's prohibited. So once upon a time, Saudi Arabia they were producing the best quality wheat in the world. It was being imported, by France. and then they kind of had to pull the plug on that because irrigation and just water became so incredibly expensive. So with technological advancements, we can see it becoming a little bit more cost efficient. So we can see that going forward. But in general, there are definitely food manufacturing, the manufacturing sector, especially in food here, is growing. Look at the dairy producers here. Look at all the juices and Al-Marai, for example, out of Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely.
Al-Marai feeds the entire region.
I always find it quite interesting that
here in Abu Dhabi, and it's.
I always find it quite interesting that all of the just as an aside note, all the dairy companies produce chickens as well. And I'm sitting there going, I thought milk came from cows anyway. Absolutely, it always confuses me.
KFC's big here.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you haven't eaten at Al Bek in Saudi Arabia, you have to eat there. So it's like one of the most popular.
I have. No, but absolutely. But I can see the manufacturing. Just to cover the manufacturing sector, just fine. I can see that the manufacturing sector. There's a real drive regionally to go across that, and I can see that there's a push to produce finished products. When you start to look at Saudi looking at altering its import tax regimes, etc., you can see that what it's driving through is to drive things through to like King Abdullah Economic City and so forth to make these points hubs. So, I can see that there's potential in the future, but you're right, it's possibly not around wheat and so forth. But anyway, to conclude all of that, I'd just like to thank you very much for joining us today, Rania. And this will be available on our website, faithful+Gould.com. If you've got any further questions, please feel free to view my profile on our website and send them through, and I'll do the best I can to respond to them. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Cheers, Rania.